Live from the Washington, D.C. area, it's the Inside Scoop. All the news that our viewers want to know. Now, here's the host.
Welcome to Inside Scoop, Virginia. I'm your host, Catherine Reed. Tonight we are going to be addressing Black Lives Matter. Not just this specific movement itself, but a conversation about racism in this country, in Virginia, here locally. And I've got two wonderful guests with me this evening. Our first guest is Andere, a nonprofit leader here in Northern Virginia that many people will know from her work starting many years ago. She also teaches nonprofit management at George Mason University. And she is a very outspoken advocate for having conversations about racism, honest conversations in order to change what is clearly a problem locally in our local communities here in Virginia and certainly on the national level. Thank you so much, Amanda, for being here tonight.
Thank you so much for having me.
So we are Facebook friends in addition to being friends in real life.
Yep.
Yes, we do that too. And so you and I have watched each other address these things, try to get people to think in a different way, to really have honest conversations. And you are very active in the faith community, and I remember many things that you say to me, many things, but one of the things I remember you saying is that Sunday is the most segregated day of the week.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think there was this feeling in our country, and I had great feelings and emotions after our current president was elected, President Barack Obama, that we were post-racial. I mean, how can a country who's experienced so much oppression for people elect a black president and we not be post-racial? And the reality is that I feel like it brought up more feelings about the tensions around race, the way that he was treated, the way that people started to talk about race in code, that really brought up some feelings about prejudice and racism and what that means in our country. And I think that was a trigger point for not only the black community, but the white community to understand that progress doesn't mean electing a leader. Progress means equality. And so having equal access and equal opportunity and being treated a certain way when you get to those positions is what people really want and what they mean by equality. And we're still not there yet.
And so we were talking earlier before the show started about what happened when Trayvon Martin was killed, that whole trial that spun out. Do you see that sort of as sort of a tipping point where it really broke the whole issue open for this country?
I think it was a tipping point for the beginning of the movement that we're seeing now. And the reality is that Black Lives Matter activists and people have been on the ground working on several different issues. And the Trayvon Martin case sparked this reality that we still have progress when it comes to injustice, that young black males are still seen as dangerous and criminals. And so the lack of justice and just the reaction by the country to that really triggered, I think, the modern movement to say enough is enough. But it's nothing new. I think I mentioned to you that the day after the verdict, we in my church kind of had a healing service, and many of my church members were active in the civil rights movement. And so they're pretty old or older, experienced, and they talked about how this has been going on for years, that they had family members who would go missing, who were killed with no justice. And this was a trend that happened in the 70s and 80s. It's just being televised more now. We're seeing it more because of social media, and I think that's the difference we're experiencing now.
And I think if we look back to it, the levels of mass incarceration, which also, parallel to this, Barack Obama was elected in 2008, and my second guest, Cayce Utley, who is from Standing Up for Racial Justice, was explaining that organization started right after he was elected. I had no idea they have been working that long on standing up for racial justice.
Right.
That was news to me. I think of them as being more recent.
Yeah.
But clearly there have been organizations working for a long time. But you see now across the aisles, people like Cory Booker and Rand Paul and Jim Webb have been talking for the last 4 years, 5 years about mass incarceration and the problem with our criminal justice system and who is being incarcerated.
Right. So I think a lot of the issues around Black Lives Matter and around racism look at the disproportionality of issues, whether that you're looking at things like mass incarceration, or you're looking at even discipline rates. I think even locally in Fairfax County, the racial disparities in terms of workforce development and opportunity in terms of career development. Whenever there are disparities, whether that's enforcement disparities, disparities in how people are treated, when you can say for the same crime, for the same action, disproportionately African American males or African American females are treated this way, then you have a problem. And the problem is within the system. And I think a lot of times people get confused racism with prejudice. So we all have prejudice. I have prejudice, right? I have biases, and we need to name those things. So we all have unconscious bias, we all have prejudice. But it's really hard for me to say that I can be racist because I don't have a lot of power. And racism stems in power. It's a system issue. It's how our systems were designed. It's not individual. So, for you to be racist, you have the power to be racist. You're not, I know you. I'm sure you have prejudice, I'm sure you have bias, but you have an ability to be racist because you have a privilege and a power that could allow you to exert that, whether that be within the system that you govern in, or in the system that benefits you for privilege. And so we get uncomfortable talking about that because no one wants to be labeled as having privilege or being racist. And so we don't ever talk about those conversations because we actually are not naming the right things.
Right, and so white privilege also is something being bandied about, to which people take great exception because they feel it is pejorative, that it's derogatory to say, when you say to somebody you're speaking from a point of white privilege, there it's like you've told them, labeled them something negative, instead of describing a situation from which they come that is not something they were born. Many of us, like we were born into it. Mm-hmm. You were born into where the family you were born into. I was born into the family I was born into. Right. But it gave each of us a starting place from where we live our lives.
Absolutely. I often say to people that, one of the only privileges I have is being a Christian and being heterosexual, right? So I experience a lot of privileges because of those two things. That doesn't mean that I wasn't blessed to live in a pretty upper middle class home and attend wonderful Fairfax County schools. So those are great privileges, but in terms of systematic privileges, that I can move throughout systems without being judged, those are the two that I have. But that is trumped by the fact that I'm young, I am Black, and so there are certain privileges that are not afforded to me or my family that we have to think about differently. Whether it's the conversations my parents had with me when I started driving, or especially my brother. Whether it's the way that I have to talk or present myself in a situation or a conversation that other people don't have to think about. Those are certain privileges that other people have that you often don't talk about because, quite frankly, I think the big problem is we don't have very intimate conversations with people who are not like us.
Right.
And so that is another privilege, that you probably can walk into most rooms and find someone that is like you.
Right.
And
you are often, and I know this from having known you for so many years, you are often the youngest person, sometimes the only woman, and sometimes the only person of color.
Absolutely. And so those are the types of privileges that we're talking about. They're structural, they're in our social interactions, they're in the way that we raise our children, things that people don't ever have to think about. When you raise young Black boys, you have to teach them how to act when they get pulled over, what things that they should do when they're driving, even what cars that they can drive. I have a really good friend who says she would never buy her young boy a luxury vehicle because in their predominantly white neighborhood they would be labeled as a drug dealer.
Right.
And so those types of things that you probably didn't think of with your son.
I don't have to worry about that with my son.
And so that doesn't mean that you have a privilege, meaning that you experience a privilege that's a little bit different, and talking about those things are really important.
And I think what befalls women of color is even talked about less than most people understand, because there have been very high profile Eric Garner and Trayvon Martin and Tamir Rice even, but Sandra Bland was something of an anomaly in this trajectory? I mean, it was for the public an anomaly of what happened with her.
So I think that because, and this is what's different now, the difference is we're seeing what has been going on. And I just want to make very clear, and I say this from a very deep passion, and I say this all the time when I talk about this issue, whether it's around police or around the justice system. I believe in our justice system. I believe in public servants. I think that especially in our local area, we have really good police officers. But I also know the other side of that, and intimately know the other side of that, and then from friends and family. So when we're talking about the way people are treated, we're seeing it differently because we do have dash cam videos, or people are recording incidents. But this is nothing new.
It's just we're seeing it.
We're seeing it
for the first time.
So I would say that how she was treated, I don't think is anything different. I think usually the results can be different for females. But if you look at the studies shown on how young black females are treated within the disciplinary system, in middle school and high school, there are huge discrepancies and disparities, that they're more likely to be treated as the person who's acting in a criminal manner than the victim or the survivor. And so you see discrepancies all the time in our systems of justice or systems of discipline. That particular case, I think, just brought up actually a lot of issues surrounding mental health, a lot of issues surrounding what happens, why someone has to be criminalized and what that does to their psyche, that you could say disproportionately might affect women or women of color or people of color.
Yeah, and I know you have in your career dealt a lot with the disparities that women of color suffer, even more so than white women do, especially in things even like pay gap and job opportunities, all kinds of things that separate out people of color, but women of color even more so. I don't think those stories are being told. We see them when there's kind of sensationalized 6 o'clock headline news, but their stories and the narrative are not being well told.
They're not being told, and they're not being addressed in a holistic sense. So one of the things that I think is really important, and I think should be a focus of any discussion, is not everyone can be at the front lines of Black Lives Matter. But there's a responsibility for those who work within the human service community, the nonprofit community, to look within themselves. So you look at the discrepancies of homelessness and poverty and women affected by that. And so if nonprofit organizations who are addressing those things don't address the discrepancies, they're doing a disservice to ending what they're supposed to be ending as a nonprofit.
Well, that's one of the things. When we come back, I want to delve a little bit more into those disparities and to some of these bigger issues that are leading to what we see now kind of as an explosion of these issues. So please join us after this break.
Art, a universal language, an expression of culture, of self. And now, thanks to Empowered Women International, a way for emerging and established immigrant and refugee artists and artisans to find hope to earn a living while enriching the lives of all of us. Empowered Women International, making a better America every day. For more information on Empowered Women International's educational programs, or to make a tax-free donation, contact cfrip at AOL.com.
Here, kitty, kitty. Here, kitty, kitty, kitty. Here, kitty, kitty.
You'd think it would be easy to tell which kids have trouble with their eyesight. But that's not always the case. Even though 1 in 4 children may have a vision problem, eye doctors tell us the symptoms aren't always so obvious. We do know that 80% of all childhood learning is visual, And without good vision, kids can have trouble learning to read and may fall behind in school. For clues on how to spot the real-life signs of childhood vision problems and what parents can do, visit checkyearly.com. A public service message from the Vision Council of America and Reading is Fundamental.
Scoop, Virginia. We are talking about Black Lives Matter and having a conversation about racism in this country and in Virginia. My guest for the first half of my show is Amanda Andere, an activist well known here in Northern Virginia for her extensive nonprofit work. When we left off on our conversation, we were talking about how young women of color, starting in middle school, high school, have their behavior criminalized, as do young men of color have their behavior. There is something called the school to prison pipeline, which is a very real thing. And I think people don't necessarily recognize it. There's a lot of people who feel like generations of families are due to poverty and economics, but it really isn't just economics. I mean, there's institutional racism. That's what it is. And it starts in school.
Well, it goes back to what we were talking about before in terms of unconscious bias. So who is referred to disciplinary action versus who is referred to action around counseling and mental health? I mean, there's tons of evidence to show that the school to prison pipeline starts by those actions. So someone is disruptive in class, are they supported and do they get help? Or are they referred into a system that treats them from criminals at the very beginning? And usually disproportionately, so not saying that there aren't white people who are referred into that system and that there aren't young black kids who need more disciplinary actions referred into that system, but disproportionately young black males, especially, and some young black girls, are referred into a system that treats them like criminals from the beginning. They don't have a chance at reform. They don't have a second chance. And so you create a system where if from the very beginning you're treated like a criminal, I've heard many times, then you start to act like a criminal, or you're never given a chance at reform or rehabilitation. And that kind of puts a stigma on you. And let's not talk about what happens, how hard it is to function in society when you get out of that pipeline, if you can get out.
Oh yeah, I mean, all of this seems to be coming together, which is why I think it seems so intense right now, is the mass incarceration that has led to the inability to get jobs once you have paid your dues to society. There's been an effort to ban the box. Again, that is going to affect disproportionately people of color because they are disproportionately the people who are incarcerated.
Right.
So getting them an opportunity to actually get jobs is critically important. Virginia recently was called out for the number of juveniles being referred. This whole thing about resource officers being in school, there's a pushback from people claiming resource officers are actually being tasked with providing discipline. School administration should be supply. You don't even know where to go with that. I am not part of the education system, and like as you said, for the most part here in Fairfax County we have wonderful schools. Throughout Virginia it's very different. I mean, you've got rural schools, you've got urban schools, you've got poor schools, and how all these different school systems are dealing with resource officers and whether behavior is in fact something that deserves police attention rather than school discipline. But Virginia definitely is not at the point on the list where we want to be. We have a problem here.
Well, and even in our very affluent and well-rated schools in Fairfax County, there's huge disproportionality in terms of the achievement gap when it comes to race and ethnicity. And with the Board of Supervisors and the superintendent know that, and they've brought in outside groups to look at those discrepancies. And there's efforts going on to address them. So that leads me to think that in other school systems where there's not as much attention and resources, quite frankly, to address it, that there's huge problems and kids who are of color or who don't speak or English is not their first language, or the economic, layered with that, the economic disadvantages that they face, will face some really tough situations when it comes to moving through a school system that doesn't value them as much.
And so part of the pushback in this discussion about Black Lives Matter has been the All Lives Matter mantra. Well, all lives matter. And in this country, which was founded based on the premise that all men are created equal, but that being in a context of common men telling a monarch that they were equal to him and therefore could start their own country, us believing culturally as part of our narrative that we do in fact embrace that all men are created equal, to me is part of the problem, because we refuse to see that narrative in light of data and hard facts and a reality that says that's not true.
So oftentimes in my church, we talk about like our worldly views versus our spiritual views. So spiritually, I believe, of course, that all lives matter. And I think many faiths believe that. Many people who are not a faith believe that. But the world that I live in tells me all the time that my life doesn't matter as much as some other lives by the way that I'm treated, by the way especially my brother or my fiance or his son is treated. So this idea, this all lives versus Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter is a movement to say that Black lives should be treated, whether it's within our justice system, whether it's in the way that they are handled by authoritarian disciplinary figures, by the unconscious bias that they face, or even just the way that we react to the death and the life of Black males and females should be equal or parallel. And that's what the movement is all about. So this, of course all lives matter, but when we have this idea that when we start to say things like blue lives matter or white lives matter, well, they've always mattered and they've always been treated above, different, and separate from Black lives, from other lives that are disproportionately historically discredited.
And a lot too has been made of the disruptive tactics that Black Lives Matter uses. And that's, again, to me, another weapon of saying this is why we shouldn't pay attention to them. The riots in Ferguson after Michael Brown's death gripped the nation, but it also divided the nation because it seemed to many people of white privilege that it just proved that they were thugs,
right?
Not protesters. And
yeah. Well, I think a couple of things, and this plays into the all lives matter. So what we're facing right now with a standoff in a government building with guns and the way that's treated versus the militarization of police of people protesting, and not being able to see protesters as different from people who riot, or not being able to see that, during the civil rights movement, those folks were called radicals and insurgents. And so I look at, the differences in the way the media or our perception of folks, even calling people thugs versus being able to clearly distinguish in this latest standoff the protesters from the people who take over a building, but we can't do that for situations in Ferguson and Baltimore. That's where Black Lives Matter stems from, is that we are constantly, whether it's in the media, in our perceptions, in our everyday dialogue, being treated differently. So I think that when young men and women are dying, and that's maybe where I think people don't understand. It's not that we want justice. That would be nice, but we actually don't want our young men and women to die. And so the radical behavior that folks think is happening is because people are tired of fearing for their sons' lives or fearing for their own lives and being told that they're overreacting. And so the radical nature of it is because there's a very emotional nature. And I look at my other friends who have kids that have died of disease or who have have other horrible things happen to them, and they become pretty radical too and very involved in their causes. Right. And no one ever says to them, "Oh, just calm down." Right. But you're dealing with something that's not as tangible as that, and I think racism is a disease. It's something that is rooted in a different way than a cancer or heart disease, but it should be treated the same. It's something that we should eradicate, that we need to address and name, and maybe sometimes be a little bit radical in erasing it.
Well, I consider it a public health issue, just like I consider guns a public health issue, and if we could take a step back and start to address these things as something that threatens our population, our families, our communities, our way of life, we could take some of the emotion out of it to align ourselves on the same side to say, how do we solve a problem? Not who's at fault or who's to blame, but how do we all as Americans or people in our own communities, how do we align ourselves so that we are focusing on solving the problem and not blaming or accusing each other? And I see that as very far off. And from the rhetoric of the presidential candidates so far, what is your hope that this will be addressed in the 2016 election?
I think it is being addressed, whether it's being addressed in the way that people want it to be addressed, but it's being talked about. I think that in some presidential campaigns, the Black Lives Matter movement and other movements, and I just want to be clear that there's the organizations like NAACP and Urban League and the Council on Civil Rights haven't existed for all these years and continue to get funding and continue to thrive because we're post-racial. So there are more radical movements that are extensions of long work that's being done. And so those groups have pushed candidates to talk about some of these issues. And other candidates are talking about it and showing their own bias and showing, how they want to treat immigrants or how we treat people who are Muslim. And so that might not be talking it in the right way, but it's unsurfacing that our country still has a lot of bias, that we still have a lot of prejudice. And when in power, we can have racism. And so until we address those issues, until we address the issues of our past, we'll never be able to move forward.
I think you're right about that, and I look forward to seeing who is going to be in the White House next. We've all got our favorites, I suppose, but really, again, looking at trying to identify this as a public health issue, something that we need to benefit all of our citizens, solving this problem, addressing the institutional biases, the things that happen in schools, the disparity in employment, the disparity in mass incarceration, that all of these things are wrapped up in a bundle, and we need to tease it apart.
Well, it absolutely is a public health issue, and those who do public health know that public health or having a healthy community has nothing to do with the health care coverage you have or the insurance you have or the doctor you see. It has to do with things like your race, your economic status, your ability to gain employment and education. And so you have this movement of public health communities. I actually think from a nonprofit perspective, public health foundations and those who are working in public health have done more for racial inequality than any other sector of nonprofits, because they see the link. They know that those factors matter in public health, and they're addressing it in different ways. And if we saw it all as that way, we would understand why we need to address the roots of these issues.
And that's why I so appreciate you being here,
Yeah.
is because you are bringing this conversation to a whole different level. So thank you so much for being our guest here tonight.
Thank you.
When we return, we are going to be talking with Cayce Utley of Showing Up for Racial Justice. So please come back after the break and we'll talk with Cayce.
One day these rats were playing in the woods. Wanted some matches and that's no good. Listen to smoke before you give it a try.
Only you.
Don't play with matches. Don't play with fire. Cause there's nothing very funny about life. Nothing very nice on a homeless mind. So if a gorgeous force is what you desire, don't play with matches. Don't play with fire.
Only you can prevent wildfires.
Fire.
Why don't you just wash your car at home?
When I wash my car, everything runs down the street and down into the storm drains. With all the chemicals in the soaps and waxes, the last thing I want to do is poison my own drinking water.
At least here, it's all contained and recycled on site.
That's why I also take my car in for oil changes instead of doing it myself. I might take a chance on spilling stuff.
You know what the best part is?
What?
More time to kick back and watch the game.
How far would you go to protect the planet?
I want you to build an ark.
Here we go. Okay, that's good. Oh, okay. Ow!
Maybe there's another way.
People, the flood is imminent!
Is it too much to ask for a little precipitation?
Go to fightglobalwarming.com to find out what you and your community can do to reduce global warming pollution.
Somewhere around the world, there are men and women of the armed forces risking their lives helping rebuild communities after natural disasters, collecting toys for needy children, tutoring kids in school. These are your sons and daughters who work to keep us safe, secure, and free. Dedicated men and women who put their country first.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Welcome back to Inside Scoop, Virginia. I'm Catherine Reed, your host. Tonight we're talking about Black Lives Matter and the conversation about racism in this country. Joining me as my guest in the second half of the show is Cayce Utley of Showing Up for Racial Justice. Thank you so much for being here, Cayce.
Thank you for having us.
So I actually met you the first time standing outside the Angelica Theater with Alex Dixon, who introduced us, because you guys were trying to raise awareness that weekend for people going to the movies about the work of Surge Northern Virginia. So you were telling me before the show started that this group is actually a national group that started in 2008.
Yes, so Showing Up for Racial Justice, the national organization, actually began in 2008, and I believe that in your conversation with Amanda, you talked about this a little bit, about after the election, President Obama, there seemed to be an uptick in white supremacist organizing. So black leaders of various different organizations came to some trusted white allies and said, we need you to start organizing white people to push back and resist this white supremacist organizing. A lot of the anti-Obama rhetoric was very racially tinged.
It was.
And we did see an increase in white supremacist organizing, whether it was around Islamophobia, but also around these issues of Black lives. And then again, like you said, the galvanizing point of Trayvon Martin's death, and then the miscarriage of justice in that situation really began to grow this groundswell of interest in white people, organizing other white people, so that black folks wouldn't have to do the work of organizing in their communities, and also trying to bring along people who were at different points and at different levels in their journey on understanding racism, understanding how white supremacy works. And so Surge started doing that work around that time, and in the last 2 years has shifted more toward a chapter and affiliate model where grassroots organizations that were already in existence are coming alongside Surge as an organization and affiliating with Surge, and new chapters like ours are springing up. Our chapter started last summer, and we were one of 132 chapters that launched last year.
Wow,
through
132
Surge.
in a year.
So it's a big movement now. A lot of white folks who are trying to support the Black Lives Matter movement are looking for a place where they can learn and start to unlearn some of the racism that we've been handed, and also to learn how to resist in a more organized way. So whether that's participating in Black Lives Matter actions and events, or whether it's organizing in our own communities and figuring out what does it look like to engage other white people in these conversations and to take on that burden for ourselves, and to relieve that load from people of color-led organizing.
So Alex is a mutual friend of ours, and I know that you all are working with organizations or within other faith communities like the Unitarian Universalist Church of Fairfax, which several of my friends belong to that particular church, and they are very active in social justice issues. So what other organizations have you kind of reached out to try to make people aware that this chapter is a place where they can go to help in this movement?
Right. So we just got started this last summer, so we're still growing. But we have found a real supportive network of faith communities. UU Fairfax is one. We've also gotten support from All Saints Sharon Chapel Episcopal Church in Alexandria, has hosted a couple of our events. And so what the church communities are finding is that that's a good opportunity for partnership with us, in that we can come in and provide some anti-racist training for their folks, but we can also partner with them in that they have facilities, and we are a grassroots organization in need of space.
Right.
So for instance, the All Saints Sharon Chapel back in the fall not only hosted a teach-in that we did on justice for Natasha McKenna in Fairfax, but also hosted a training that we had on how to engage your white friends and family in conversations about racial justice, because that's, like you referenced earlier, the Facebook conversations and the hard family conversations. We did a training on that right before Christmas and the holidays, and so did DC Surge. There's an organization for Surge in DC.
Those holiday dinners where it's needed most.
Yes, well, and it's where it's typically avoided. I mean, there was a big SNL skit right before Thanksgiving about diffusing those horrible conversations with common interest in Adele, but you know, that's really not moving anyone forward. You know, us continuing to deflect and avoid, that is an aspect of white privilege, and it is an aspect of white supremacy, and you know, violence against people of color thrives when white people are silent. So we have to do the work of engaging our own communities, and a lot of times that's going to mean explaining to people around the dinner table, no, Ferguson, for instance, wasn't rioting. It was an armed occupation of a neighborhood. How would you feel, you know, Aunt Sue, if your neighborhood was taken over by militarized police? And so it's about creating a different narrative with our friends and family, but also pushing back on structures that are imposing injustices in Black and brown communities, and that includes our area. I mean, unfortunately, it does include Fairfax County. We are a very diverse county, but we still have a stronghold of racialized policing. You mentioned all the other issues earlier, but and that's a huge problem that we have here. So we want to start addressing that. We want to start resisting that in our communities and taking action to see change.
So do you see, I mean, other than raising awareness and participating in some of the events that are being held around the Northern Virginia area, but it seems like doing outreach through teaching, and faith communities are a great place to start. Do you see your efforts expanding into the school system, of offering some kind of trainings or seminars into the school system?
There are some groups locally that already do some of that work with teaching in the school systems. There are obviously structural barriers to that as well. I mean, we've seen in the last week or two, a teacher in New York got fired for trying to teach about racial justice in her city, and that's in New York. So, you know, in Virginia, we have similar barriers to dealing with that. We would love to get that kind of access, but I think for now, what we're really focused on is educating adult white folks about these issues, engaging young people where we can, but also supporting people of color-led organizing, because that's how, as white folks, we stay accountable to people of color, and we don't go off on our own, but we're acting in concert with and in solidarity and support of people of color-led organizing.
So I know you connected me with the people at the Black Lives Matters DMV, but what are some of the other organizations that you are working with that are operating in our area?
Oh, there's a lot. A lot of them are based in DC. So there's organizations like One DC and BYP 100. We've talked with an organization, Tenants and Workers, in Alexandria that organizes young people. We've worked with, we attended a protest with Cayce, which organizes Latinos and Latinas around immigration issues, and so we joined them in a protest when Donald Trump came to Manassas, and we also joined local students. There's really thriving student organizing going on at George Mason, and so Black students there, and also the Dreamers that are there are very well organized and very capable, very strategic young people, very mindful of the current political landscape and the stakes, and very engaged in local community activism and statewide activism. And so we actually followed their leadership in going into the Trump rally and disrupting from the inside. So that was an interesting thing, because we were working with the adults beforehand and protesting out on the street, and then we went in with the students to try and support them and show some solidarity and encourage their leadership, because they are really capable and just completely inspiring to what we're trying to do.
And I think it really shows that coalitions can work. I mean, I see more of that because I sit on the board of Equality Virginia and NARAL Pro-Choice Virginia, and some of the NARAL people, I think, was quoted outside the Trump rally on WTOP. And it's great to see those organizations, social justice organizations, working in concert in a coalition that is loosely formed. In other words, there's not a rigid hierarchical sort of thing. It's being able to communicate. So channels of communication, what are the best ways you have to do outreach as far as channels? I know you've got a Facebook page.
We do have a Facebook page. We're very active on that. So if you go to facebook.com/SurgeNova, you can find us. We also have a website, surgenova.org, and a Twitter handle. You can find us through those different channels, and we try to keep those things up. We also have an email list that you can sign up for through our website. So we're trying to keep as many channels open as possible, because we know a lot of times people need to hear things more than once. But really what we want to do is amplify the work that Black Lives DMV is doing and other organizations in our area, and then to begin to work in our community in different ways. So like, for instance, we have a training coming up on how to talk to your children about race, and that's going to be held at the UU Fairfax at the beginning of February, and we'll be putting information out on how to register for that soon. And we're working with a number of different people in the faith community about coordinating a vigil for Natasha McKenna, who was killed, because we're coming up on the anniversary of her death when she was tased and while shackled and naked at the adult detention facility in Fairfax. And there's been no accountability in what happened to her. And so we want to hold some space for her, remember her life and honor her life, and just remind the people in our community that we're still waiting for justice in her case, and it's indicative of the larger problem that we have, the systemic problems that we have that affect Black women in particular and make them particularly vulnerable.
That is fantastic. And so we're going to take a break here in a few minutes, and I do want to come back and talk about some of the specific things. Amanda had mentioned that there are existing organizations like the Urban League, the NAACP, have been around for a long time, but their structure is very different from some of the new organizations that are springing up, and so people are working together in a different way. So we're all kind of marching toward the same goal, but we're kind of doing it in a different sort of way. And I think, given the density of population in Northern Virginia, the fact that we tend to be more liberal than the rest of the state, that you would think we are a bellwether here in Northern Virginia, as far as you think. We hope that we're a bellwether as far as what we could accomplish in the rest of the state by the efforts that we're making here in Northern Virginia, and how effective those efforts really are. And so I would love to get back and dig a little deeper into the things that are coming up. I know Martin Luther King Day is going to be on Monday the 18th. I think a lot of things are planned for Richmond. I think things are planned in DC. It is an auspicious occasion because we honor this man who was so important in the civil rights movement, and to consider the fact that we have not gotten to that post-racial. So please join us when we return from our break, and we will talk a little bit more about showing up for racial justice with Cayce Utley.
So they say it's a man's world? I don't see anybody's name on it.
While they were doing their thing, we slowly changed our world.
Today, women can do anything men can do. And there's one thing we're even better at.
Open enrollment is back. Enroll Virginia wants you to get covered for 2016 and beyond. You have until January 31st to enroll in affordable health care. If you wish to have coverage by January 1st, you must enroll by December 15th. That's less than a month from now. Remember, the penalty for not having health insurance next year is a minimum of $695 per person. Don't think twice about it. To find an enrollment event near you or to get free help with the application, visit our webpage or give us a call. El periodo de inscripción ha comenzado. Enroll Virginia quiere que tú y tu familia tengan cobertura médica este próximo 2016. Tienes hasta el 31 de enero para inscribirte. Si deseas cobertura desde el 1 de enero, debes inscribirte antes del 15 de diciembre. Recuerda que si no tienes cobertura el próximo año, te multarán una suma mínima de $695 por cada adulto. No lo pienses más y visita nuestra página para más información o para ayuda con la solicitud.
Hey, Hard, what's this? That's my resignation letter. You're resigning? Why? Because you're constantly ignoring me. You're half as active as you used to be, and you eat stuff like this. You've been putting me under a lot of pressure lately. That's why I'm ready to quit. I forgot. I'll do better. Please, don't quit on me. Okay. But remember, it's not what you say. It's what you do.
Listen to your heart. Don't let it quit on you.
Let's go for a walk.
Uncontrolled high blood pressure could lead to a stroke, heart attack, or death. Get yours to a healthy range before it's too late.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Welcome back to Inside Scoop Virginia. I'm your host, Catherine Reed. Joining me in our conversation about racism in Virginia and in this country is Cayce Utley from Standing Up for Racial Justice, Northern Virginia. Thank you so much, Cayce.
Thank you.
So in this final segment, because we've only got 13 brief minutes, I wanted to talk about all of the ways in which people can really have these conversations. You know, a very weird thing happened at Christmas time where a video went viral on Facebook and on the internet about a mother who gave her daughter a black baby doll. And the reaction of this child to receiving a black doll. The distress, the crying. They had a boomerang effect in that there were other videos that cropped up thereafter, including from some of my own friends, showing photos of their children with black baby dolls that they loved, and talking about how their children had not had a problem, that they chose their own dolls or wanted their own dolls. But what does this say? What does this layer of involving children and dolls say about where we are in this conversation? And what can we do, starting with the family unit, to diffuse some of this?
Well, I think our, not to replug it, but our upcoming training is gonna address some of this, because I think that as white folks, we don't realize that we are passing messages on to our children about race and about racial preferences, about biases. But really, what strikes me about a lot of this is that, and when you talk about these things going viral, I think it comes back to our focus as white folks tends to be on this interpersonal racism, right? So I'm prejudiced. I don't like, I think that black people are not as attractive, that kind of a thing is what we saw, that ugliness in that video. But the truth of it is that that's not just a function of interpersonal racism, right? So there's the systemic element of lack of representation. Where are we seeing black women, and how are we seeing black women portrayed in the media? How are we seeing representations of people of color in the media, and how does that affect us? What are the stories that we're telling ourselves and our children about people of color? And so there's more of a broader issue there at play, as well as just this interpersonal thing. But I think that a lot of, when you talk about the folks that were quick to push back on that and say, look, here are my children with this, I think there's a tendency among white folks for us to want to prove that we're the good white people, right? So we want to absolve ourselves of the legacy of white supremacy. We want to distance ourselves from that. And we see a lot of that in progressive communities in particular. But this is where as Surge, we kind of work to call in even progressive white folks, and we say, look, these issues of systemic racism, you being a good white person and your intentions are not as important as their impact. So when you kind of put yourself in that position and say, I'm a good white person. We look at a lot of the policies that are affecting black communities now, a lot of the crime policies, a lot of the drug policies were instituted by progressives, progressive presidents like Bill Clinton. Hillary Clinton co-signed a lot of that kind of stuff, the crime legislation, imposing additional requirements on poor women before they could receive benefits through TANF and and things like that. So a lot of these structural things were imposed by progressive politics. So when we talk about dismantling white supremacy, we're not leaving any corner unexamined in that.
I think that's important.
Yeah, we have to look at ourselves as well. And so one of the things we do is calling in other white people is say, look at your own your own motivation here, and decenter yourself in this conversation. Get yourself out of the middle of it, because I think a lot of what we saw in that viral video situation was a determination to prove that there are good white people out there. And the truth is we know there are good white people out there, but we're still living in a system where white people are the majority. Right. And yet these things still occur. So how good really are we? Are we really working?
That's an honest.
Are we really working to live up to that label as good white people, or are we more interested in getting the label than we are in seeing justice be done? And so that's where we have to keep challenging ourselves and pushing ourselves to do better. We can't rest on this idea that that somehow we're the good guys, because when these things exist, it's because we lack the political will to see change. So how can we begin to organize around that? And there's lots of different ways we can organize around that. We've been working on direct actions like protesting at Trump. We've done a few other demonstrations, but it's not just demonstrations. It's also things like you mentioned, like talking to your relatives, how to talk to your friends and family, how to change those narratives in our circles of influence, but also through things like petitions, through social media interactions. There's a lot of different ways that you can become engaged. One of the things that I love about Surge is that we maintain accountability by saying that any fundraising we do for ourselves, we expect folks who give to us to financially match that gift with an equal gift or more to a Black-led organization. Wow. So one of the things that people can do right now is start giving to Black-led organizations. And I think that we, as white folks, we have more capital. I mean, I know I don't feel like I have a lot of capital, that's true, but I have enough capital to go to Target, so I'm doing okay. So how can we begin to divest from these systems of white supremacy and begin to reprioritize in a way that invests in and funds Black futures? That's a huge movement that's been coming up is investing in Black futures. And so how can we as white people support that and enter into that? There's a lot of different ways that we can become involved.
That brings to mind when you were talking about the various ways. There was a Donors Choose a project just before Christmas at Oakton High School. Mm-hmm. And I love Donors Choose. I fund a lot of projects, usually in rural schools around the state. But this teacher at Oakton High School was raising money to get copies of a book called Brown Girl Dreaming, so that each of her students could have their own copy of that book. Yeah. And I thought, well, that's something worth contributing to, because this is one way in which a teacher, and this is including it in a curriculum, but it's giving people, the fact that she wanted these kids to have their own copy of this book to me was so significant. There are probably many ways, if we really sat down to think about it, that we could influence in classrooms, in our homes, in our communities, any place where there's a group of people, to just look around and be aware either of the diversity or the lack of diversity. To Amanda's point, she and I have been in rooms together where she's the youngest, or we're a small group of women, or she is the only person of color or the only woman of color. And so just for people to be aware that when you look around a room at the lack of diversity, whether it's the panel at the front, there's a wonderful Tumblr called Congratulations, You Have an All-White Male Panel. But it's a funny Tumblr thing, except it's made me aware every time I sit in a room and I see a panel of white male, I'm taking a picture, I'm going to post this, because it's like an all-white male panel. Why do we still have those? So I really believe that what you're doing as an organization, helping people get inspired to think outside themselves as the center. I think that's something you said that has really resonated with me.
Well, and to your point about the spaces, I think being observant of the spaces that you're in is a good exercise to and a good practice anyway, to look around the room and say, who's being left out? who's being ignored, whose voices are not represented. And you know, what's interesting is as I've become more active in local government and in paying attention to these issues at our level here in Fairfax County or in Alexandria, Arlington area, even in Prince William, I have been really overwhelmed by the whiteness of the spaces. And honestly, that is why we exist as Surge, because we need white people who can go into those white spaces and address other white people on these issues, because it shouldn't be up to women like Amanda to always be the voice of their people. At some point, white people need to start challenging other white people. And that's the thing that we always avoid, right? That's that's the number one rule of White Club, is no one talks about White Club. So we have to start to begin to recognize it for ourselves, but then also begin to push back and challenge it and resist it, and to be able to say when we see things unfold, to be able to stand up. You know, I have I read a great piece in the Toast. Do you follow the Toast?
No, I don't.
It's a wonderful blog.
Cool.
And so everybody look at the Toast. Last week, written by a woman named Nicole Chung, and she talked about how she was at a holiday party and someone made a racial comment toward her, being an Asian woman, remarked that she looked like the entire cast of Fresh Off the Boat. And you know, she was stupefied, and she goes on in the piece that she wrote to talk about just the ways in which people of color are marginalized in those spaces, and the you know, the inability for a person in her situation to really speak back about that, because then you've ruined the party, or you know what I mean? So
yes,
like, what position are we consistently putting people of color in? And what's remarkable about that, not so much isn't that occasion happened. Like, we know that these things happen. We've all been in rooms where they've happened. But what would be really remarkable would be for some white person in that assembly to challenge the silence and to push back on that and to address that and to take the heat off of her and to put the heat back on the person who flung that comment her way, and to really push back on that. So I think you know, that's what we want to be able to do, right? We want to be ready, because I think those moments happen and we're shocked and we're confused and we don't know what to say, and you don't have the right words.
So nobody says anything.
You just sit there and you're silent, and the person of color has to take all of the weight of that, and it's just really, it compounds the injustice. So when we say that white silence perpetuates these things, we're not only talking about this interpersonal level, but we're talking about the systemic level. Because when you look at the seats of power, you know, when we watch the Board of Supervisors in Fairfax get sworn in, it's overwhelmingly white.
Well,
I mean, our county is
the General Assembly too.
It's General Assembly.
And our legislature, our Congress, our Senate.
Our Congress.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, and so how can we get into those spaces and use our sameness to challenge our own people on this? Because honestly, white folks instituted these systems of oppression. We've got to take them apart. Like, that's on us.
Well, that is fantastic. I think you have opened some of the things you said have so resonated with me.
Good.
I hope everybody comes to your training.
Yes.
So at UUCF, and follows your Facebook page and your Twitter. It's Surge Northern Virginia, standing up for racial justice. Thank you so much for being our guest here tonight,
Thank you
Cayce.
for having me.